My name is Edith Mae Hartwell, and at 82 years old, I thought I knew everything about heartbreak. Lord knows I'd lived through plenty, buried my Harold 15 years ago, watched friends pass on one by one, seen my neighborhood change from the tight-knit community, where everybody knew your business, to a place where folks barely wave. But sitting there in my dining room that Sunday morning last spring, staring at the mahogany table Harold had saved 3 months of overtime to buy back in 1967, I discovered there was still a new kind of pain waiting for me. The table was set for 6, same as always. White linen tablecloth my mother had embroidered, the good china Harold's mother had passed down, Royal Albert, with the tiny pink roses that used to make Teresa clap her hands when she was little. I'd been up since 5:30, same as every Sunday for the past 47 years, making cheese grits and country ham, fresh biscuits, and the peach preserves I'd been putting up from the tree in my backyard since before any of my children were born. Caleb arrived first, naturally, always punctual when there might be something in it for him. At 48, my eldest still carried himself like the high school quarterback he'd been, though the years of good living had added considerable weight around his middle. His wife Brittany followed behind him like she always did, checking her phone instead of saying hello. They'd been married 6 years now, but I swear that girl looked right through me like I was furniture. "Morning, Mama," Caleb said, giving me one of those perfunctory kisses on the cheek that felt more like an obligation than affection. "Something smells good in here." Teresa breezed in next with her yoga mat still under her arm, had to let everyone know she'd been to her morning class, of course. At 45, she'd spent a fortune trying to look 30, and the result was something unsettling, like a doll that had been left in the sun too long. She wore one of those flowing white outfits she claimed connected her to the universe, though as far as I could tell, the only thing it connected her to was her bank account. "Mama, you know I'm mostly plant-based now," she announced, surveying the breakfast spread like it might contaminate her aura. "Did you remember to make something without animal products?" Mark came last, looking like he'd rather be anywhere else on earth, my youngest at 42, and the one who'd worried me most. He'd never quite found his footing after college, drifting from one job to another, one relationship to another, always waiting for life to happen to him instead of making it happen. He gave me a quick hug that felt genuine enough, but I could see him already eyeing his phone, calculating how long he'd have to stay. We sat around that table, and I served them the same breakfast I'd been making their whole lives. The conversation stayed surface level, Caleb's latest business venture, something about buying rental properties, Teresa's wellness coaching certification, and her new client who was really ready to transform her life. Mark's silence broken only by occasional grunts when directly addressed. It was when I was refilling coffee cups that it happened. Brittany was showing pictures of their recent cruise, and I was trying to follow along, trying to be the interested grandmother and mother-in-law I'd always been. There was a photo of them at some fancy restaurant on the ship. "Oh, that looks lovely," I said, leaning in to see better. "What a nice time you and—" I paused, the name slipping away from me like water through my fingers. "You and Caleb's wife must have had." The silence that followed was sharp enough to cut glass. I watched Brittany's face change, saw the look she exchanged with Caleb. Teresa actually giggled. "Mama," Caleb said slowly, like he was talking to a child, "this is Brittany. You know Brittany, we've been married 6 years." "Of course," I said quickly, feeling heat rise in my cheeks. "Brittany. I'm sorry, dear. Sometimes names just—" But Teresa was already pulling out her phone. "Oh my God, this is perfect," she said, holding it up. "Mama, can you say that again? About forgetting Brittany's name? This is going to be hilarious." I should have said no, should have told them to put that phone away and show some respect. But I was so rattled, so embarrassed, that I just sat there while she recorded me, while they all laughed at my confusion. After they left earlier than usual, I noticed I sat in my kitchen, feeling smaller than I had in years. The dishes sat in the sink unwashed, which wasn't like me at all. That's when I heard Lucinda's key in the back door. "Mrs. Hartwell," she called out. "How was brunch with the family?" Lucinda Morales had been coming to help me 3 days a week for the past 2 years. At 42, she had a warmth that seemed to fill whatever room she entered. She was studying to be a nurse while working as a home health aide, supporting 2 teenagers on her own after her husband had passed from cancer. I'd grown more comfortable with her than I had with most people. Maybe because she listened when I talked instead of waiting for her turn to speak. "Oh, you know," I said, but my voice cracked on the words. She took one look at my face and sat down beside me at the kitchen table. "What happened?" I told her about forgetting Brittany's name, about the phone, about how they'd all laughed. What I didn't tell her was what I'd overheard as they were leaving. Caleb's voice drifting back from the front porch. "It's getting worse. We might need to start thinking about what happens when she's finally gone." Lucinda listened without interrupting, then said something that surprised me. "Mrs. Hartwell, forgetting a name doesn't make you less than you were. My grandmother used to say that sometimes our minds protect us by letting go of things that don't deserve to be remembered." I looked at her, this woman who called me by my name instead of just Mama, who remembered I liked 2 sugars in my afternoon tea, who noticed when I was having a bad day with my arthritis. She'd been in my life for 2 years, and already she knew me better than the children I'd raised. That night, lying in the bed I'd shared with Harold for 37 years, I stared at the ceiling and wondered when I'd become invisible in my own family. When had I stopped being Edith Mae Hartwell, the woman who'd raised 3 children after their father died, who'd worked as a secretary at First National Bank for 28 years, who'd built this home and this life with her own 2 hands? When had I become just an inconvenience waiting to die? But there was something else growing alongside the hurt, something I hadn't felt in years. It was small and quiet, but it was definitely there. Harold used to call it my stubborn streak, and he'd said it with pride. Maybe it was time to remember who I really was. It was my neighbor Dolores who told me about the video. She called Tuesday morning while I was watering the petunias on my front porch, and I could hear the discomfort in her voice even before she said the words. "Edith Mae," she started, then cleared her throat the way she did when she had to deliver bad news. "I think there's something you need to see. My granddaughter showed it to me yesterday, and I've been sick about it ever since." Dolores had lived next door for 18 years. Ever since she and Bill moved down from Charleston, we'd shared coffee on countless mornings, had each other's spare keys, and had never needed to explain ourselves to each other. When she said she was coming over, I knew it was serious. She arrived with her tablet and a grim expression that reminded me of the day she'd had to tell me she'd seen Harold's x-rays in Dr. Peterson's office. We sat at my kitchen table, and she pulled up something called Facebook, a mystery to me, though I'd heard my children mention it. "It's on Brittany's page," Dolores said quietly. She shared it with some kind of laughing emoji and wrote, "When your mother-in-law can't remember your name after 6 years of marriage. Family dinners, am I right?" There I was, pixelated and small on that screen, looking confused and vulnerable in my own dining room. My voice sounded thin and old as I fumbled for Brittany's name, and then came the laughter, my own children's laughter at my expense. The comments underneath were worse than the video itself. Strangers making jokes about senior moments and time for the home, people I'd never met treating my dignity like entertainment. But it was Teresa's comment that cut deepest. "Mum's really losing it these days. At least she still remembers how to make those biscuits. For now anyway," followed by more of those awful laughing faces. I stared at that screen until the words blurred together, feeling something inside me that I hadn't felt since Harold's funeral, a cold, clean anger that settled in my bones like winter. "Honey, I'm so sorry," Dolores said, reaching across the table to squeeze my hand. "Some people just don't have any raising at all." After she left, I sat in Harold's old recliner in the living room, surrounded by 43 years of memories. Pictures of my children's first days of school, their graduations, their weddings, awards I'd won at the bank for customer service, photos of Harold and me dancing at our 25th anniversary party. Evidence of a life lived with purpose and love, reduced to a 30-second video for strangers to mock. That's when I remembered Harold's letter. He'd given it to me the night before he died, when the cancer had him so weak he could barely hold a pen. "Don't open this unless they show you who they really are," he'd said, his voice barely a whisper. "I pray you'll never need it, but Harold Hartwell didn't raise no fool. I see what I see." I'd kept that letter in my jewelry box for 15 years, sealed and untouched, choosing to believe in the best of people, even when Harold warned me otherwise. My husband had been a gentle man, but he'd also been a banker for 35 years. He understood people's relationship with money in ways that sometimes scared me. The envelope was yellowed now, my name written in Harold's careful script across the front. Inside, 3 pages of his familiar handwriting, words that reached across death to speak to this exact moment. My dearest Edith Mae, it began. If you're reading this, then I was right about what would happen after I'm gone. I hoped I was wrong, but I've been watching them for years, and I see how they look at this house, at our savings, at the life we built together. He wrote about conversations he'd overheard, assumptions he'd noticed, the way our children had started treating our home like a future inheritance instead of a present sanctuary. He wrote about Caleb, asking pointed questions about insurance policies, about Teresa's sudden interest in my jewelry, about Mark's passive expectation that everything would simply be provided for him. They think I don't know about the money, Harold continued. Let them think that. But Edith Mae, you know where everything is hidden. You know about the accounts they never saw, the investments I made that you helped research. You were my partner in everything, including preparing for this. I had to stop reading and catch my breath. Harold had always handled our finances, but he'd included me in every decision. I'd been the one who researched stocks while he was at the bank, the one who tracked our investments in a ledger he taught me to maintain. I'd assumed that knowledge would die with him, but looking at his letter, I realized he'd been preparing me to use it. When Lucinda arrived that afternoon, she found me in the living room with Harold's letter in my hands and determination in my heart. Mrs. Hartwell, you look different today, she said, settling into the chair across from me. What's happened? I told her about the video, about the comments, about the way my family had turned my confusion into content for strangers to mock. I watched her face change as I spoke, saw the anger flash in her dark eyes. That's elder abuse, she said firmly. What they did, humiliating you publicly like that. It's not just cruel, it's illegal. I'm studying elder care law as part of my nursing program, and Mrs. Hartwell, you have rights. She told me about legal protections for elderly people, about emotional abuse and exploitation, about resources I never knew existed. But more than that, she validated what I was feeling, that this wasn't just a family squabble or a misunderstanding, it was systematic disrespect, and it had been building for years. My grandmother went through something similar, Lucinda continued. Her children started treating her like she was already gone, making decisions about her life without including her. It broke her heart, but it also woke up a part of her she'd forgotten existed. I looked at Harold's letter again, at his final paragraphs where he'd written, "You are stronger than they know, smarter than they remember, and richer than they imagine. Don't let them write the ending to your story. You've got more chapters left in you than they could ever dream." That night, I made a decision. If my children wanted to treat me like a doddering old woman who couldn't remember names, then perhaps it was time to show them exactly how much this doddering old woman could remember, starting with where Harold hid the safe. The safe was exactly where Harold said it would be, hidden behind the false back he'd built into the bottom drawer of his old desk. 30 years I'd dusted around that desk, and I'd never known it held secrets. But Harold's letter had been specific. Third plank from the left, press down and slide right. Our insurance policy is waiting. My hands shook as I opened it that Wednesday morning, not from age but from anticipation. Inside were documents I'd never seen, bank statements from accounts I didn't know existed, and a thick manila envelope marked for Edith Mae's eyes only in Harold's careful script. The numbers didn't make sense at first. I had to read them 3 times, put on my reading glasses, and read them again. Harold Hartwell. My quiet, methodical husband, who'd clipped coupons and saved every penny, had been worth nearly $10 million when he died. $10 million. I sat there in his office, surrounded by evidence of a financial genius I'd never fully comprehended. Stock certificates from companies I'd researched for him in the evenings after dinner. Investment accounts that had grown and split and grown again over 35 years. Real estate holdings in Atlanta and Tybee Island that he'd bought before anyone else saw their potential. The manila envelope contained what he called the contingency plan, a detailed strategy for dealing with ungrateful heirs. Harold had anticipated this moment with the precision of a chess master, laying out steps to protect both my dignity and my legacy. If they can laugh at your confusion, he'd written, let's see how they handle their own. The plan was elegant in its simplicity. First, establish the extent of their greed by allowing them to believe I was more vulnerable than I actually was. Second, document every instance of elder abuse and disrespect. Third, create a decoy will to lull them into complacency while preparing the real inheritance surprise. And fourth, execute justice with the precision of a surgeon and the patience of a Southern woman who'd been underestimated her entire life. At the bottom of the safe was a business card I recognized. Theodore Gaines, estate attorney, the same lawyer who'd handled Harold's will 15 years ago. Harold's note was attached. Ted knows everything. He's been waiting for your call. I called Mr. Gaines that afternoon, and his secretary put me through immediately. Mrs. Hartwell, he said, and I could hear the warmth in his voice. I was wondering when I'd hear from you. Harold said it might take some time, but that you'd call when you were ready. Theodore Gaines was 72 years old and had been practicing estate law in Savannah for 47 years. He'd grown up 3 streets over from where Harold and I had lived, and his mother had gone to school with mine. In Savannah, those connections matter more than any degree hanging on the wall. Harold asked me to wait for your signal, he continued. He said you'd know when it was time to protect yourself. I take it that time has come. I met with Ted the next morning at his office on Bull Street, in one of those grand old mansions that had been converted to professional suites. His office still had the original hardwood floors and crown molding, the kind of understated elegance that whispered old money and older secrets. Harold was my client for 35 years, Ted said, settling behind his mahogany desk with files that were thicker than phone books. But more than that, he was my friend. He loved you more than life itself, Edith Mae, and he worried about what would happen to you after he was gone. Ted spread out documents that painted a picture I'd never fully seen. Harold hadn't just been a careful saver, he'd been an investment savant who'd used his position at the bank to identify opportunities decades before they became obvious. He'd bought Coca-Cola stock in the 1960s and held it through every split. He'd invested in technology companies in the 1980s, when most people thought computers were a passing fad. He'd bought land when Savannah was still sleepy, and sold parcels when the tourism boom made them worth fortunes. Your current liquid assets sit at approximately $8.2 million, Ted said, matter-of-factly. The real estate holdings add another $1.8 million. Harold was very specific about keeping this information from your children until you decided how to handle it. I stared at the numbers, thinking about Sunday mornings when my children complained about coming to brunch, about how they treated my home like a burden they'd eventually have to deal with, about Caleb's casual comment about when she's finally gone. Harold also left specific instructions about your current will, Ted continued. The one your children think exists leaves everything divided equally between them. Harold wanted them to believe that right up until the moment they learned otherwise. He showed me the real will, the one only he and Harold had known about, the one that left everything to me with complete freedom to redistribute as I saw fit, the one that had been designed to give me options they'd never see coming. Mrs. Hartwell, Ted said gently, Harold told me to ask you one question when the time came. Do you want justice, or do you want revenge? I thought about that video, about the strangers laughing at my confusion, about 43 years of marriage reduced to entertainment for people who didn't even know my name. I thought about the children I'd raised alone after Harold died, the sacrifices I'd made, the love I'd poured out only to have it thrown back in my face with laughter. What's the difference? I asked. Ted smiled, and for a moment he looked exactly like the boy who used to steal figs from my mother's tree. Justice is giving them what they deserve. Revenge is making sure they know exactly why they're getting it. I picked up the pen he offered me. Then I choose both. What my children didn't know, what they'd never bothered to learn, was that their mother had been keeping books and managing accounts since before they were born. Harold had been the face of our financial success, but I'd been the mind behind it. Every investment decision had been discussed at our kitchen table, every stock purchase researched by my hands in the evenings after I'd finished the housework. They thought they were dealing with a confused old woman who couldn't remember names. They had no idea they were facing a financial strategist who was about to teach them the most expensive lesson of their lives. Acting confused turned out to be easier than I'd expected. All I had to do was amplify the small moments of genuine forgetfulness that come with being 82, and my children immediately assumed I was losing my mind entirely. It was almost insulting how readily they believed I'd become incompetent overnight. I started with small tests, calling each of them with requests that would reveal their true priorities. The results were more damning than even Harold's cynical predictions had suggested. When I called Caleb and told him I was confused about my insurance bills and needed help understanding them, his first question wasn't about my health or well-being. It was whether I'd considered making him a co-signer on my accounts to make things easier. When I mentioned that I'd been thinking about updating my will, I could practically hear him salivating through the phone. "That's a great idea, Mama," he said, his voice taking on that patronizing tone I'd grown to despise. "Why don't I come over this weekend and we can look at your paperwork together? Make sure everything's in order." Teresa's response was even worse. When I called her crying about feeling lonely and forgotten, she suggested I look into senior communities where I could be around people my own age. She offered to research facilities for me, but only after confirming that I'd be selling the house if I moved. "The equity in that place could pay for years of care, Mama," she said. "And honestly, it's way too much house for one person. You'd be happier somewhere more manageable." Mark's reaction was perhaps the most heartbreaking, because it was the most passive. When I told him I was struggling with basic tasks and felt overwhelmed, he made sympathetic noises, but offered no real help. Instead, he suggested I ask Caleb or Teresa, since they were better with that kind of stuff. My youngest child, the one I'd worried about and supported through every failure, couldn't even be bothered to pretend he cared about my welfare. But it was Lucinda who helped me see the full scope of what was happening. She'd been observing my family's behavior for 2 years, and when I finally told her what I was doing, she wasn't surprised by their reactions. "Mrs. Hartwell," she said, as we sat in my kitchen after Caleb's latest visit, "they're not just being selfish, they're systematically isolating you and undermining your confidence. In my elder care classes, we learned this is textbook financial abuse preparation." She'd been quietly documenting incidents for months without my knowledge, not out of suspicion, but because her training taught her to recognize warning signs. She showed me notes she'd kept about conversations she'd overheard, times when my children had made decisions about my life without consulting me, instances when they'd dismissed my concerns or capabilities. "Would you be willing to help me document what happens next?" I asked her. "I'm planning to give them exactly what they think they want, control over a confused old woman. But I want evidence of how they handle that responsibility." Lucinda agreed immediately, and together we developed a system for recording interactions without them knowing. Her nursing program had taught her about legal requirements for elder abuse documentation, and she made sure everything we collected would hold up in court if necessary. The real test came the following Thursday, when I invited all 3 children over for what I called an important family meeting. I'd scattered papers around the dining room table, old bills, insurance documents, bank statements from accounts that barely held $1,000, and worked myself into a convincing state of distress. When they arrived, I was the picture of an overwhelmed elderly woman drowning in paperwork she couldn't understand. "I don't know what to do anymore," I said, allowing my voice to quaver convincingly. "These bills keep coming, and I can't make sense of any of it. Harold always handled everything, and I feel so lost without him." The transformation in their faces was immediate and telling. Instead of concern for my emotional state, I saw calculation. Instead of comfort, I heard opportunity. Caleb took charge, as I'd known he would. "Mama, this is exactly what I've been worried about. You can't keep handling all this alone. Look at this mess, bills scattered everywhere, no organization, no system." He began sorting through the papers with the efficiency of a predator who'd spotted wounded prey. "What you need is someone to help you manage your finances, someone who can make sure bills get paid on time, that your money is being handled properly." Teresa chimed in with false sympathy. "Oh, Mama, I had no idea things had gotten this bad. Why didn't you tell us sooner? We could have been helping you all along." The lie was breathtaking in its audacity. I'd asked for help dozens of times over the past year, only to be told they were too busy or that I was managing just fine on my own. But now that they sensed vulnerability, suddenly they were ready to step in as my saviors. Mark, true to form, said nothing but nodded along with his siblings' assessments. He was content to let them handle the details as long as he benefited from the outcome. "I think we need to talk about power of attorney," Caleb said. And there it was, the real reason for their sudden concern. "Just temporarily, you understand. Just until we can get your affairs organized and make sure you're protected." I looked around the table at these three people I'd carried in my body, nursed through illnesses, loved unconditionally for decades. They were sitting in the home I'd maintained, eating cookies I'd baked that morning, discussing how to take away my autonomy as casually as they might plan a vacation. "Power of attorney," I repeated slowly, as if I'd never heard the term. "That means you would handle my money." "Just to help you, Mama," Teresa said quickly. "Just to make sure nothing falls through the cracks. You'd still live here, still have everything you need. We'd just take care of the complicated stuff." Lucinda, who'd been quietly cleaning in the kitchen within earshot, caught my eye and nodded slightly. She was getting every word. "I suppose that makes sense," I said finally. "I do feel so overwhelmed by it all. Maybe having help would be good." The relief on their faces was almost comical. They thought they'd won, thought they'd successfully manipulated a confused old woman into signing away her independence. What they didn't realize was that they'd just provided me with everything I needed to destroy them. Creating the decoy will was Ted Gaines' idea, but I have to admit, I took considerable pleasure in crafting the details. We designed it to give my children exactly what they expected, a simple, straightforward division of what they assumed was a modest estate. The fake document left the house to be sold with proceeds split three ways. My savings account showing only $47,000 divided equally, and my personal possessions distributed according to a list that gave each child items they'd already been eyeing. We even included a small bequest to Lucinda, $5,000 for her faithful service, because we knew that would seem both generous and realistic to people who had no idea what faithful service was actually worth. "The key," Ted explained as we reviewed the document in his office, "is making sure they find it in a way that feels accidental. They need to believe they've discovered something you didn't mean for them to see yet." The opportunity came sooner than expected. Caleb had been pressuring me about the power of attorney papers, calling every few days to ask when we could finish up that paperwork. I finally invited him over the following Saturday, ostensibly to review financial documents but actually to set the trap. I spent Friday night carefully arranging my dining room like a stage set. The decoy will was placed inside a manila folder, labeled important papers, positioned just slightly under a stack of bills on the dining room table, where Caleb would be sure to notice it when he inevitably started rifling through my documents. When he arrived Saturday morning, I played my role perfectly, the overwhelmed widow who couldn't organize her own affairs. I made a show of gathering papers from various rooms, creating enough chaos that he'd naturally start trying to impose order. "Mama, you can't keep important documents scattered all over the house like this," he said, exactly as I'd predicted. "What if there was a fire? What if something happened to you and we needed to find your will or insurance papers?" "My will," I said, feigning confusion. "Oh, that's around here somewhere. Harold had his lawyer draw one up years ago, but I haven't looked at it in forever." I watched him begin sorting through the papers, with the systematic efficiency of someone conducting a treasure hunt. When his fingers found the manila folder, I saw his eyes light up with the particular gleam of a man who thought he'd struck gold. "Is this it?" he asked, holding up the folder with barely contained excitement. "Oh yes, I think that might be it," I said, settling into my chair with a cup of tea. "You can look at it if you want. I trust your judgment about these things." The next few minutes were a masterpiece of poorly concealed greed. Caleb read through the document with the kind of intense focus usually reserved for lottery tickets, and I could see him calculating numbers in his head. The house was worth at least $300,000. My savings account would give them each about $15,000, and the personal possessions included items they'd already been dividing up in their minds for years. "This looks pretty straightforward, Mama," he said, trying to sound casual while clearly pleased with what he'd discovered. "Everything split equally between the three of us, just like it should be." He took pictures of every page with his phone, probably to share with his siblings immediately after leaving. I pretended not to notice, just nodded along as he explained the legal language to me like I was a child learning to read. While Caleb was congratulating himself on his discovery, the real will was being finalized 40 blocks away in Ted Gaines' office. The genuine document was a work of art, crafted with the precision of a surgical strike and the justice of a perfectly balanced scale. The real will left everything, all $10 million, the house, the investments, the land holdings Harold had accumulated over decades, to Lucinda Morales. Not as a gift, but as recognition of the love, respect, and genuine care she'd shown when my own flesh and blood had failed me. But the document went further than simple redistribution of wealth. It included detailed explanations of why each child was being disinherited, complete with dates, quotes, and documentation of their treatment of me. Ted had crafted language that would make the will nearly impossible to contest, while ensuring that anyone who read it would understand exactly why I'd made this choice. The will included provisions for Lucinda to establish a non-profit organization focused on elder care and protection, something that would turn Harold's lifetime of careful investments into a legacy that would protect other elderly people from the kind of treatment I'd endured. "Are you absolutely certain about this, Edith Mae?" Ted asked, as I prepared to sign the final documents. "Once this is filed, there's no going back. Your children will inherit nothing." I thought about the video that was still circulating online, about strangers laughing at my confusion. I thought about Caleb's gleeful expression as he discovered what he thought was his inheritance. I thought about years of being dismissed, ignored and treated like a burden, instead of the woman who had sacrificed everything to raise them. "They've already made their choice about what I'm worth to them," I said firmly. "Now I'm making mine about what they're worth to me." Lucinda served as witness to the signing, though she had no idea what the document contained. As far as she knew, we were simply updating my estate planning to include provisions for my care as I aged. When Ted explained that she might inherit a small token of my appreciation for her service, she actually tried to refuse. "Mrs. Hartwell, you don't owe me anything beyond what you already pay me," she said. "Taking care of you isn't a burden. It's been one of the greatest privileges of my life." Those words, spoken with genuine emotion while my own children were at home calculating their inheritance, sealed my conviction that I was doing the right thing. That evening, Caleb called to check on me, his voice warmer than it had been in months. Clearly, he'd shared the contents of the fake will with his siblings, and suddenly they were all very interested in maintaining a good relationship with dear old Mama. "I was thinking we should have family dinner more often," he said. "Maybe every Sunday, like we used to. Teresa and Mark think that's a great idea too." I smiled into the phone, imagining their shock when they learnt the truth. "That sounds wonderful, dear. I'd love nothing more than to spend time with my family." After all, I wanted them close enough to witness every moment of their downfall. The attack on Lucinda came exactly 1 week after Caleb's discovery of the fake will. Teresa arrived at my house on Tuesday afternoon, while Lucinda was helping me organize my bedroom closets, a task that had become our code for reviewing documentation and legal strategies. I heard Teresa's voice before I saw her, sharp and aggressive in a way that immediately put me on alert. She'd let herself in with the key I'd given her years ago, back when I still believed my children would use it to check on my welfare, rather than spy on my activities. "We need to talk," Teresa announced, her yoga-toned body radiating the kind of hostile energy she usually reserved for people who questioned her wellness expertise. Lucinda emerged from the bedroom with quiet dignity, her professional demeanor intact, despite the obvious tension crackling through the air. At 42, she had the composed bearing of someone who'd faced down plenty of difficult situations. Raising 2 teenagers alone had prepared her for conflict. But I could see she was puzzled by Teresa's aggressive approach. "Good afternoon, Miss Teresa," Lucinda said politely. "Your mother and I were just organizing her seasonal clothes. Would you like me to give you some privacy?" "Actually, this concerns you too," Teresa said, her voice taking on the patronizing tone she used with people she considered beneath her notice. "I think it's time we discussed your role in this household and whether it's still appropriate." I felt my blood pressure rise, but I forced myself to remain seated in my chair, playing the role of the frail elderly woman who couldn't possibly understand the undercurrents of what was happening. "I'm not sure I understand," Lucinda replied, her professional training keeping her voice level, despite the obvious insult. Teresa began pacing around my living room like she owned it, touching my possessions with the casual entitlement of someone already dividing up an estate. "My mother is becoming increasingly dependent, and frankly we're concerned that having someone like you around might be taking advantage of her vulnerability." The accusation hung in the air like poison gas. I watched Lucinda's face carefully, saw the hurt flash in her eyes before her professional mask clicked back into place. "I would never take advantage of Mrs. Hartwell," Lucinda said firmly. "I care about her well-being and respect her independence." "Oh, I'm sure you do," Theresa said with a laugh that had no humor in it. "Especially since she's probably mentioned you in her will. Tell me, how much is she leaving you? A few thousand? 10,000? Must be nice, getting paid to befriend old people, and then getting a bonus when they die." I had to grip the arms of my chair to keep from standing up and slapping my daughter. The cruelty of her words, the casual way she dismissed both Lucinda's genuine affection for me and my capacity to judge character, revealed a depth of selfishness that Harold's warnings had only hinted at. Lucinda drew herself up to her full height, and for a moment I saw not the quiet caregiver who helped me with daily tasks, but the strong woman who'd raised 2 children alone, put herself through nursing school, and maintained her dignity in the face of loss and hardship. "Mrs. Hartwell has never discussed her will with me," Lucinda said, her voice steady as granite. "And even if she had, that wouldn't be your business. My relationship with your mother is based on respect and genuine care, concepts you might want to research." Theresa's face flushed red with anger. "How dare you speak to me like that? I'm trying to protect my mother from people who would exploit her, and you have the nerve to lecture me about respect." "Ladies, please," I interjected, using my most fragile voice. "I don't understand what this is about. Theresa, dear, Lucinda has been wonderful to me. She helps me remember to take my medications and drives me to doctor's appointments. I don't know what I'd do without her." Theresa turned to me with the kind of forced patience usually reserved for difficult children. "Mama, that's exactly the problem. You've become too dependent on her. We think it might be time to consider other arrangements." The threat was clear: agree to dismiss Lucinda, or they'd find ways to force the issue. But what Theresa didn't realize was that she was being recorded by the small device Lucinda had activated when the conversation turned hostile. After Theresa left in a cloud of righteous indignation and veiled threats, Lucinda and I sat in my kitchen sharing the kind of silence that follows a storm. She was shaken, I could tell, though she was trying to hide it for my sake. "Mrs. Hartwell," she finally said, "I need you to know that I've never expected anything from you beyond fair payment for my work. Your daughter's accusations were completely unfounded." I reached across the table and took her hands in mine. They were trembling slightly, and I realized that for all her professional composure, Theresa's attack had cut deep. "Lucinda, dear, I know exactly what kind of person you are. You've shown me more genuine care in 2 years than my own children have shown me in decades. Don't let their ugliness make you doubt your worth." That's when I made the decision to tell her the truth. Not everything, but enough to help her understand what was really happening and what her future held. "There's something I need to share with you," I said, pouring fresh tea for both of us. "My family believes I'm worth very little. They've seen bank statements showing modest savings, and they think this house and a few personal possessions represent the sum total of my estate." Lucinda listened without interrupting, her dark eyes focused on my face with the kind of attention she'd always given me. "What they don't know," I continued, "is that Harold was far more successful with investments than anyone realized. My actual estate is worth considerably more than they imagine, and I've been working with my lawyer to ensure it goes to someone who actually deserves it." I watched understanding dawn in her eyes, followed immediately by concern. "Mrs. Hartwell, if you're thinking of leaving me something in your will, I want you to know that's not why I'm here. I genuinely care about you, not your money." "I know that," I said softly. "That's exactly why you're the right person to receive it." I explained Harold's contingency plan, the documentation we'd been gathering, and the real will that named her as my primary beneficiary. Her reaction was everything I'd hoped for: shock, gratitude, and an immediate concern for how to use such a gift responsibly. "I want to establish a foundation," I told her, "something that protects elderly people from the kind of treatment I've experienced. Harold's money should do more than just transfer wealth. It should create change." Lucinda was quiet for a long moment, processing not just the financial implications, but the trust I was placing in her. "Mrs. Hartwell, I promise you that if this really happens, I'll use every penny to honor your memory and protect other people in your situation. But are you absolutely certain? Your children are going to be devastated. I thought about Theresa's cruel words, about the video that was still making strangers laugh at my expense, about years of being taken for granted by the people who should have treasured me most. My children chose to see me as a burden and an inheritance instead of as a person worthy of love and respect, I said. They've made their choice, now I'm making mine. That evening I called Ted Gaines to finalize the executor provisions of my will. Lucinda would not only inherit my estate, she would have complete control over how it was distributed and what legacy it created. For the first time in months, I went to sleep, feeling truly at peace. The heart episode wasn't planned, but it provided the most revealing test of character I could have asked for. It happened on a Thursday morning while I was tending to my roses, a sharp pain in my chest that dropped me to my knees right there in the garden soil I'd been cultivating for 43 years. Lucinda found me there when she arrived for our regular appointment. I was conscious but weak, and the fear in her eyes as she called 911 was the kind of genuine terror you can't fake. She rode with me in the ambulance, holding my hand and speaking softly in both English and Spanish, telling me everything would be fine even though I could see she wasn't sure herself. At Memorial Health University Medical Center, they ran tests and determined I'd had a minor heart attack, serious enough to require monitoring, but not immediately life-threatening. The cardiologist, Dr. Martinez, was a young woman about Lucinda's age, who treated me with the kind of professional respect I'd forgotten existed in the medical world. "Mrs. Hartwell, you're stable now, but we want to keep you for observation for at least 48 hours, she explained. At your age, we need to be very careful with cardiac events. Lucinda stayed with me through the first day, sleeping in the uncomfortable hospital chair and making sure the nurses understood my medication schedule and dietary preferences. She brought me my own nightgown from home, kept my water glass filled, and read to me from the romance novel I'd been working through, small kindnesses that made the sterile hospital room feel less frightening. My children's responses to news of my hospitalization revealed everything I needed to know about their priorities. Caleb arrived first, but not until the following morning, and his first question wasn't about my condition, it was about whether I'd brought my important papers to the hospital in case something happened. He seemed almost disappointed when Dr. Martinez explained that my prognosis was good. "So she's going to be fine?" he asked, and I could hear the subtle deflation in his voice. "With proper care and lifestyle modifications, your mother could live many more years," Dr. Martinez replied. Caleb's face fell slightly before he caught himself. "That's wonderful news, of course. We just want to be prepared for, well, you know, these things can be unpredictable at her age." Teresa arrived later that day with a bouquet of flowers that looked suspiciously like they'd been purchased from the hospital gift shop 5 minutes earlier. She made a show of fussing over me, but I noticed her attention kept drifting to practical matters. "Mama, we should probably talk about your living situation when you get out of here," she said, settling into the chair. Lucinda had vacated to give us privacy. "This heart attack is a warning sign that you might need more supervision than you're getting at home." The implication was clear, another push toward assisted living that would necessitate selling my house and liquidating what they thought were my modest assets. But what really chilled me was the casual way she discussed my future, as if I weren't lying right there, fully conscious and capable of making my own decisions. Mark's visit was the most heartbreaking, because it revealed the depth of his indifference. He stayed exactly 15 minutes, spent most of that time checking his phone, and left as soon as he'd fulfilled his obligation as a dutiful son. No genuine concern, no offers to help with my recovery, just the minimum effort required to avoid looking bad to his siblings. But it was what they said when they thought I was asleep that provided the most damning evidence of their true feelings. Lucinda had left briefly to get coffee from the cafeteria, and my children gathered in my room for what they thought was a private family conference. I kept my eyes closed and my breathing steady, listening to them discuss my future like I was already gone. "The doctor said she could live for years," Caleb said, frustration clear in his voice. "But realistically, how much longer can she maintain that house? And with her memory issues getting worse, the memory thing might actually work in our favor," Teresa replied. "If she's declared incompetent, we could get guardianship and make decisions for her own protection. I don't want to be responsible for managing her affairs." Mark said, Can't we just put her somewhere and let the professionals handle it? Caleb's response was the most chilling. The sooner we can get power of attorney, the sooner we can start protecting the assets. She's already too attached to that nurse, and God knows what she might promise her if we're not careful. Speaking of the nurse, Teresa added, I think we need to get rid of her. Mama's becoming too dependent, and frankly, I don't trust her motives. They discussed my life and death with the casual efficiency of people planning a business transaction. No tears, no genuine concern about my comfort or happiness, just calculations about how to manage the inconvenience of my continued existence. When Lucinda returned and found them huddled around my bed, the shift in atmosphere was palpable. Suddenly they were the concerned children again, discussing their worry for their dear mother's recovery. But Lucinda wasn't fooled. I saw her eyes narrow slightly as she observed their performance, and I knew she was cataloguing every detail for the documentation we'd been building. That evening, after my children had left and the hospital had settled into its nighttime rhythm, I told Dr. Martinez I wanted to be discharged against medical advice. She tried to convince me to stay for the full observation period, but I was adamant. Doctor, I said, I'm 82 years old, and I've learned to trust my instincts about what's best for me. Right now, what I need most is to be in my own home, surrounded by people who genuinely care about my well-being. Lucinda supported my decision, promising to monitor me closely and bring me back immediately if any symptoms returned. The contrast between her protective concern and my children's calculations was stark enough to make even Dr. Martinez comment on it. You're very fortunate to have such a dedicated caregiver, she told me as she reviewed my discharge instructions. Many patients don't have that kind of support system. As Lucinda helped me into her car for the ride home, I made a decision that would accelerate everything I'd been planning. We need to move faster, I told her. What I heard today convinced me that waiting any longer would be dangerous. They're planning to have me declared incompetent and take control of my affairs. Lucinda nodded grimly. I recorded most of their conversation while I was getting coffee. They didn't realize I'd left my phone in the room. That recording would become the centerpiece of our documentation, clear evidence that my children were more interested in managing my money than protecting my dignity or respecting my autonomy. The heart attack had been a setback, but their response to it had handed me the final proof I needed to justify everything that was coming next. The rumors about my declining health started spreading through Savannah's social circles exactly as I'd planned. A word here, a concerned comment there, and soon half the city believed Edith Mae Hartwell was on her last legs. The heart attack had provided the perfect cover for what Ted Gaines called the final act. My children's response to these rumors was more revealing than any test I could have devised. Instead of spending more time with their supposedly dying mother, they began planning for my death with an efficiency that would have impressed a funeral director. The family meeting they called for the following Sunday was ostensibly about making sure Mama's affairs are in order, but I knew better. They wanted to finalize their inheritance strategy before I became too incapacitated to interfere. I played my part perfectly, appearing frailer than I actually felt, and allowing them to believe my recent hospitalization had accelerated my mental decline. When they gathered around my dining room table, the same table where they'd humiliated me months earlier, I let them think they were managing a confused old woman who couldn't possibly understand the implications of their planning. Mama, Caleb began with false gentleness, we want to make sure everything is arranged properly for when the time comes. Have you given any thought to your funeral preferences? The question was absurd on its face. I was sitting right there, very much alive, and they were discussing my burial plans like I was already gone. But I nodded along, playing the role of the compliant elderly woman who was grateful for their sudden attention to details. I suppose I should think about those things, I said softly. Harold's funeral was so beautiful, I'd want something similar. Teresa pulled out a notebook. She'd come prepared with a list of questions that revealed just how thoroughly they'd been planning for this moment. What about the house, Mama? Have you thought about what should happen to it? Oh, I suppose it will need to be sold, I replied, watching their faces light up with barely concealed excitement. It's much too big for one person, and I know you children have your own homes and lives. Mark, who rarely spoke during family gatherings, suddenly became animated. We could help you with that, Mama. Real estate transactions can be complicated. especially when you're not feeling well. The speed with which they moved from discussing my funeral to planning the sale of my property was breathtaking. Within an hour, they'd outlined a complete strategy for liquidating what they believed was my estate, with each of them taking responsibility for different aspects of the process. But the most damning moment came when Teresa suggested we create legacy videos, recordings of me sharing memories and final thoughts that could be played at my funeral. It would be so meaningful for everyone who loved you, she said, setting up her phone to record. Just share some of your favorite memories of raising us, or advice you'd want to pass on. What followed was a masterclass in manipulation disguised as sentimentality. They prompted me to share stories about their childhoods, but their real interest was in getting me to express gratitude for their current attention and to validate their roles as devoted children. I gave them exactly what they wanted, speaking in a trembling voice about how proud I was of the adults they'd become and how grateful I felt for their love and support. The irony was lost on them completely. They were so focused on crafting a narrative that would make them look good at my funeral that they couldn't see the cruel absurdity of the entire exercise. But what they said after they thought the recording was over provided the most devastating evidence yet of their true feelings. Caleb had stopped the video, but left his phone on the table, and none of them realized it was still capturing audio as they discussed their plans for my estate. God, I hope she doesn't linger for months, Teresa said, her voice stripped of the fake sweetness she'd used during the recording. Dealing with all this emotional stuff is exhausting. At least we'll finally be able to get our hands on some real money, Mark added. I've got debts that inheritance check will wipe clean. Caleb was more calculating in his comments. The key is making sure we control the process from start to finish. No interference from outsiders, no last-minute changes to the will. We need to be the ones handling every detail. They discussed my death like a business opportunity, complete with timelines and profit projections. The woman who had sacrificed everything to raise them, who had worked 2 jobs to pay for their educations, who had mortgaged her future to ensure their success, was now nothing more than an inconvenient delay in their financial planning. What they didn't know was that Lucinda was in the kitchen, ostensibly cleaning but actually recording every word through the app we'd installed on her phone. By the time they left that evening, we had documentation that would make their disinheritance not just justified but inevitable. After they'd gone, I sat in my living room surrounded by the detritus of their planning, notebooks full of funeral arrangements, real estate estimates and asset valuations. They'd spent 3 hours in my home discussing my death and never once asked how I was feeling or whether there was anything they could do to make my remaining time more comfortable. That night, I called Ted Gaines at home, something I'd never done in all the years I'd known him, but these were extraordinary circumstances. Ted, I said when he answered, I want to schedule the will reading, soon. Are you sure you're ready? He asked gently. Once we do this, there's no going back. I thought about the legacy videos, about my children planning my funeral while I sat in the next room, about 43 years of love and sacrifice being reduced to an inheritance timeline. I've never been more ready for anything in my life, I told him. They want to plan my funeral. Let's give them something worth mourning. The invitations went out the next morning, formal legal notices requiring the presence of all beneficiaries for the reading of Edith Mae Hartwell's last will and testament. The date was set for the following Friday at 2 p.m. in Ted's office. My children's excitement was palpable when they called to confirm their attendance. They thought they were finally going to collect their reward for a lifetime of pretending to love me. They had no idea they were walking into the most expensive lesson of their lives. The morning of the will reading, I woke up feeling more peaceful than I had in months. I dressed carefully in my best navy blue dress, the one Harold had always said brought out my eyes, and the pearl necklace he'd given me for our 25th anniversary. If this was to be my moment of reckoning, I wanted to look like the dignified woman I'd always been, not the confused old lady my children had convinced themselves I'd become. Lucinda arrived early to drive me to Ted's office, and I could see she was nervous about what was to come. She still didn't know the full extent of what she was about to inherit, and her anxiety was touching in its genuine concern for everyone involved, including the children who had treated her so poorly. Mrs. Hartwell, she said, as we drove through downtown Savannah, are you absolutely certain about this? Your children are going to be devastated. My dear, I replied, watching the familiar streets of my hometown pass by. My children made their choices long ago. They chose to see me as a burden and an inheritance check, rather than as a person worthy of love and respect. Today they'll learn that choices have consequences. Ted Gaines' office was packed when we arrived. My 3 children had come early, clearly eager to claim their windfall. Caleb had even brought Brittany, probably to witness his moment of triumph. Teresa was dressed in what I recognized as her spiritual advisor outfit, flowing fabrics and crystal jewelry that suggested deep wisdom and cosmic connection. Mark sat quietly in the corner, checking his phone as usual, but I could see the anticipation in his body language. What surprised them was the presence of additional witnesses. Ted had invited several people whose attendance was required by law, including a court reporter and a representative from the probate office. The formal nature of the proceeding seemed to make them slightly uncomfortable, but I could see they interpreted it as evidence of the estate's significance. Before we begin with the reading of Mrs. Hartwell's will, Ted announced, "I want to share some context that will help everyone understand the decisions she's made." He moved to a large screen that had been set up in the conference room and began playing a carefully edited compilation of recordings we'd collected over the past several months. My children's voices filled the room as they discussed my declining mental state, their plans to gain control of my affairs, and their calculations about my death. The color drained from their faces as they heard their own words played back. Caleb discussing power of attorney as a pathway to asset control. Teresa suggesting I be declared incompetent for my own protection. Mark expressing his desire to avoid responsibility for my care, and all 3 of them planning my funeral while I sat in the next room. But the most devastating moment was the audio from their legacy video session, where their fake grief and manufactured memories were immediately followed by their true feelings about the inconvenience of my continued existence. "That's enough," Caleb said, half rising from his chair. "This is a private family matter. You have no right to record our conversations." Ted smiled with the particular satisfaction of a lawyer who had anticipated every possible objection. Actually, all of these recordings were made with Mrs. Hartwell's full knowledge and consent, either in her own home or in public spaces where she had every right to document interactions. "Everything you've heard is completely admissible in court." The room fell silent as Ted opened the official will document and began reading the formal legal language. But even in legalese, the message was crystal clear. Every asset, every investment, every dollar of the $10 million estate was being left to Lucinda Morales. The explosion of outrage was immediate and predictable. Caleb jumped to his feet, shouting about undue influence and mental incompetence. Teresa began sobbing dramatically, claiming I'd been manipulated by a gold-digging caregiver. Mark sat in stunned silence, probably calculating how much debt would remain unpaid. But it was Lucinda's reaction that touched my heart most deeply. She sat frozen in her chair, tears streaming down her face, not from joy, but from the overwhelming weight of responsibility I was placing on her shoulders. "Mrs. Hartwell," she whispered, "I can't. This is too much. I never expected." I reached over and took her hand in mine. "My dear, you gave me something my own children couldn't: genuine love and respect. Harold's money should go to someone who will use it to honor his memory and protect people who can't protect themselves." Ted continued reading the specific provisions of the will, including the requirement that Lucinda establish a non-profit organization focused on elder care and protection, and the detailed documentation of why each of my children was being disinherited. The legal language was clinical, but the message was devastating. Caleb was being disinherited for treating me as a financial asset rather than a mother. Teresa, for publicly humiliating me and attempting to manipulate my mental state. And Mark for his complete indifference to my welfare and well-being. "This is insane," Caleb shouted, his face red with rage and disbelief. "She's clearly not competent to make these decisions. We'll contest this will and have her declared mentally unfit." Ted smiled again, pulling out another thick folder. "I expected you might say that. Mrs. Hartwell underwent complete psychological and competency evaluations last month. Sarah Chen, one of the city's most respected geriatric psychiatrists, has certified that she is fully competent to make her own financial and legal decisions. The evaluations had been my idea, one final way to ensure that their inevitable legal challenges would fail. Dr. Chen had spent hours with me, testing my memory, my reasoning ability, and my understanding of my financial situation. Her report concluded that I was not only competent, but exceptionally sharp for someone my age. Furthermore, Ted continued, Mrs. Hartwell has prepared a statement explaining her decisions which she asked me to read aloud. He began reading my letter, written in my own words and my own voice, explaining 43 years of motherhood, sacrifice, and unconditional love that had been repaid with mockery, manipulation, and greed. I detailed every incident of disrespect, every moment when they'd chosen their own convenience over my dignity, every time they'd treated me like an inconvenience instead of the woman who had given them life. As Ted read my final paragraph, I watched my children's faces and felt something I hadn't expected, not satisfaction, but profound sadness for what we all could have been. I hope, Ted read in conclusion, that my children will eventually understand that love and respect cannot be inherited. They must be earned. Perhaps losing this inheritance will teach them the value of the things that money cannot buy. The room erupted again, but I barely heard the shouting. I was looking at Lucinda, who was still crying quietly, overwhelmed by the trust I'd placed in her and the responsibility that came with it. Justice, I realized, felt different than I'd expected. Not triumphant, but necessary. Not joyful, but right. 6 months after the will reading, I was sitting in the garden of the cottage. Lucinda had built on the 5 acres she purchased with part of her inheritance. The morning sun was warm on my face, and I was watching her daughter Maria tend to the roses we'd planted together in the spring. At 17, Maria had her mother's gentle strength and was planning to study elder care social work with a full scholarship funded by the Hartwell Foundation for Elder Protection. The cottage was perfect. 2 bedrooms, a sunlit kitchen, and views of the Savannah River that reminded me of the happiest days of my marriage. Lucinda had insisted I live there rent-free for as long as I needed, calling it the least I could do for the woman who had changed her entire family's future. The non-profit she'd established was thriving beyond either of our expectations. The Hartwell Foundation had already helped 43 elderly people escape situations of abuse or neglect, providing legal assistance, temporary housing, and the kind of advocacy I wish I'd had during my darkest moments with my own children. Harold's investment genius was finally serving the purpose he'd always intended, protecting people who couldn't protect themselves. Lucinda emerged from the cottage with 2 cups of coffee and the morning paper, settling into the chair beside mine, with the comfortable ease of someone who had become family in every way that mattered. "You made the news again," she said with a smile, holding up the Savannah Morning News, front page of the lifestyle section. The headline read, "Local Foundation Fights Elder Abuse, How One Woman's Inheritance Changed Everything." Below it was a photo of me at the Foundation's first annual gala, surrounded by the people we'd helped and the volunteers who made our work possible. The article told the story of an elderly woman who had been mistreated by her own family, who had used her inheritance to create a legacy of protection for others facing similar situations. It mentioned the legal precedents we'd set, the awareness campaigns we'd launched, and the lives we'd changed. What it didn't mention, because I'd asked the reporter to leave it out, was the specific amount of money involved or the identity of my children. I still believed in protecting their privacy, even after everything they'd done. "Any word from them?" Lucinda asked gently, the same question she'd asked every few weeks since the will reading. "Nothing," I replied, which was exactly what I'd expected. Ted had told me they'd filed their legal challenge within a week of the reading, demanding that I be declared incompetent and the will overturned. When that failed, they'd tried to claim undue influence and elder abuse on Lucinda's part. When that failed too, they'd simply disappeared from my life entirely. I'd heard through Dolores that Caleb was struggling financially. Apparently, he'd been counting on his inheritance to cover some bad business investments. Teresa had moved to Arizona to start fresh with her wellness coaching, reinventing herself far away from the family scandal. Mark had simply faded into the background of his own life, as passive in defeat as he'd been in everything else. Part of me had hoped that losing the inheritance might shock them into understanding what they'd lost. I'd imagined apologies, attempts at reconciliation, perhaps some recognition of how their behavior had contributed to the situation. But that was the naive hope of a mother who still wanted to believe the best of her children, even after they'd shown me their worst. That afternoon I settled at the small writing desk, Lucinda had placed in the cottage's sunroom and began working on the project that had occupied my evenings for the past several months, a memoir about surviving family betrayal and finding new purpose in later life. The book wasn't meant to be published, at least not yet. It was my way of processing everything that had happened and ensuring that other elderly people facing similar situations would know they weren't alone. Ted had suggested that it might eventually become part of the Foundation's resources, a guide for people who needed to understand their rights and options when family members became predators instead of protectors. I wrote about the warning signs I'd ignored, the legal protections I'd learnt about too late, and the importance of building chosen family when blood family failed. Most importantly, I wrote about the possibility of redemption and renewal, even in the 8th decade of life. It's never too late to take control of your own story, I wrote in what would become the final chapter. Age brings vulnerability, but it also brings wisdom. Use both to your advantage. Trust your instincts about who truly cares for your well-being, and never apologize for protecting yourself from people who would exploit your love. As the sun set over the river, I closed my notebook and walked out to the garden where Lucinda was watering the vegetables we'd planted together. Her son Carlos, now a sophomore in college, on a full scholarship, was helping her weed the tomato plants while talking about his studies in non-profit management. This was what family looked like. I realized, not the obligation of blood, but the choice to love and support each other through difficult times. Lucinda and her children had given me something my own offspring couldn't: genuine affection, respect for my autonomy, and the security of knowing I was valued for who I was rather than what I owned. That evening, as we shared dinner on the cottage porch, I felt a contentment I hadn't experienced since Harold's death. The Foundation was helping people who needed it most. My money was creating positive change in the world, and I was surrounded by people who genuinely cared about my happiness. Do you ever regret it? Lucinda asked as we watched fireflies begin to dance in the garden. The decision to disinherit them, I mean. I considered the question seriously, as I had many times over the past months. Did I regret choosing justice over blood? Did I wish I'd found another way to handle their betrayal? Did some part of me hope they'd eventually learn and grow from the experience? I regret that it was necessary, I said finally. I regret that they chose greed over love, manipulation over respect, and calculation over compassion. I regret that 43 years of motherhood ended with them planning my funeral while I sat in the next room. I paused, watching the last light fade from the sky over the River Harold, and I had loved so much. But I don't regret ensuring that Harold's legacy would protect people instead of enabling selfishness. I don't regret choosing dignity over obligation, and I certainly don't regret the family I've found here with all of you. Later that night, as I prepared for bed in my comfortable cottage surrounded by people who loved me, I thought about the letter I'd written but never sent, the one explaining to my children what they could have had if they'd simply treated me with the respect I deserved. Perhaps someday they'd understand. Perhaps they'd realize that the greatest inheritance I could have left them wasn't money, but the example of how to love unconditionally and how to treat family members with dignity and respect. But that understanding, if it came at all, would have to be their choice. I'd made mine. May they remember, I thought as I drifted off to sleep in my peaceful garden cottage, what they chose to forget: my name, my love, and my worth.